Dear students, I welcome you all to the very first online learning module of English for class 12th. There are two textbooks prescribed in English for the students of class 12th, Flamingo and Vistas. Today, in this introductory module, I shall discuss in detail the first lesson from the book, Flamingo, which is incidentally titled as The Last Lesson, written by Alphonse Daudet. The module consists of the following: about the author, theme of the lesson, brief introduction, reference images, gist of the lesson, followed by the question bank. Let's talk about the author. The author's name is Alphonse Daudet. He was a French novelist and a short story writer. During Franco-Prussian War, he was enlisted in French army. Now, let's discuss the theme of the lesson. Many themes are running parallel in this lesson. However, the themes of freedom of culture and language and love for one's country are predominant in the story. The last lesson reflects upon the arrogance of the colonizer to forcibly take away the rights of those who are colonized. The lesson stresses upon the importance of education and the necessity to respect and learn one's own language. The story also draws our attention to the unfair practice of linguistic chauvinism. But do you know what is linguistic chauvinism? Well, it is the idea or belief that one's language is superior to the others, especially if it happens to be the language used by the ruling class. Let me now give you a brief background and introduction of the lesson. The lesson is set during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71. France was defeated by Prussia, led by Bismarck. The French districts of Alsace and Lorraine were occupied by Germany. A young boy named Franz is the narrator of the lesson. He talks about the last lesson of French language at school. An order had come from Berlin to ban teaching and learning of French in these districts. In fact, the Prussians were trying to impose their language upon the French people. The lesson talks about what undergoes on the minds of the students. Mr. M. Hemmel, the French teacher, is taking the last lesson in French language. Students, while reading the lesson, you will experience so many emotions of the students and the teacher, especially the feeling of being forcibly detached from using and learning one's own language. Before we proceed further, I would like you to have a look at these two reference images from Franco-Prussian War. In the first image, the red color shows the presence of the French army and the light gray color shows the presence of Prussian and German army. The next image is also of the Franco-Prussian War. Now let's discuss the lesson in detail. The narrator of the story is a young school-going boy named Franz. That morning, he was scared as he was late for school. Also, as the teacher, M. Hemmel, had announced the previous day that he would test them on the topic of participles, and Franz did not know anything at all. He was more scared of being scolded. Franz had another option in his mind: to miss school and enjoy the day out in the warm and bright weather. He describes the scene. There were birds chirping on the trees and the noise of the Prussian soldiers doing the drill behind the sawmill could also be heard. The scene outside was more attractive than the school, but Franz controlled the temptation and chose to attend the school. As Franz walked past the town hall, he noticed a huge crowd at the notice board. The war with Prussia had begun 2.5 years ago, and since then, all the bad news, like losing the war, occupation of Alsace and Lorraine by the enemy, all these were communicated to the people through this bulletin board. Franz kept on walking towards the school and thought in his mind that what news could have been put up on the board now. As he walked hurriedly towards the school, the blacksmith, who was also reading the news and had come along with his trainee, called out to Franz from behind and told him that he needn't go in such a hurry, as there was plenty of time for him to reach the school. Now Franz thought that the blacksmith was making fun of him, as he was already late for school. When Franz reached the garden outside the school, he was out of breath, as he had walked very fast. Franz describes the usual scene at the school in the mornings. A lot of noise created by the moving of desks, children repeating their lessons, and teachers striking the table with the rulers could be heard. That day was very unusual, as there was no such sound coming out of the school, and it seemed that the school was closed as it used to be on a Sunday morning. Franz had planned that he would take cover under the commotion and reach the class without being noticed, but that did not seem to be possible. Franz peeped inside his class and saw his classmates seated and an Himmel, their teacher, walking in the class with a ruler made of iron placed under his arm. Franz feared a beating. He was in fact ashamed of being late and feared a scolding, as he had to enter the classroom in front of everyone. Franz found it extremely strange, as M. Himmel did not say anything, and on the contrary, politely asked him to get to his seat, as the class was about to begin without him. Franz hurried to his seat. After some time, when he overcame the scare and became comfortable, he noticed that the teacher had worn his best embroidered clothes that day. The teacher normally wore it on the occasions like inspection and prize distribution days. Franz wondered if that day was a normal day. Then what could be the reason for M. Himmel to wear such clothes? Franz felt that the atmosphere in the school was unusual and serious. And to add to it, the last benches of the classroom were occupied by the senior village men. So many of them were sitting at the back benches and reading like children. Franz was confused and could not figure out what was going on. Just then, M. Himmel told them that it was their last lesson in French, as the Prussians in Berlin had ordered that French language would no longer be taught in the schools of Alsace and Lorraine, and that German language was to be taught instead. The German teacher would arrive the next day, and this was the last lesson in French, so he wanted them to pay full attention. Franz was shocked to know that he could not learn French any longer, and now he knew the latest news that had been put up on the bulletin board of the town hall. Franz regretted for not being serious towards his studies and for wasting his time in hunting birds' eggs and playing in the Saar. Till now, Franz considered his books to be an unwanted burden, but suddenly he starts considering them to be his best friends, whom he could never leave. The writer wants to show here the change in Franz's attitude towards study after hearing the news that he could not learn French any longer. The news that their teacher, M. Himmel, was leaving also had a similar impact on him. Franz did not want him to go away. He no longer thought the teacher to be short-tempered and strict. Now Franz knew that M. Himmel was wearing his best dress in honor of his last lesson. He also realized that the village men had come to pay respect and thank M. Himmel for his service of 40 years in the school. The village men had come to the class as they were also repenting for not having studied well in their childhood. They had come to thank their teacher for his 40 years of service as a teacher of French. Also, they wanted to show respect to their country and were sad as their mother tongue, French, could no longer be taught to them. The teacher calls out to Franz as it is his turn to recite the topic of participles. As the news had impacted Franz, he was eager to study, and so he was desperate to show his eagerness. He wanted to be able to recite the topic in one go and without any mistake and please his teacher. His desperation is reflected in his willingness to give away all that he had in return for reciting the lesson well. As Franz did not know the lesson, he got confused and stood quietly. His heart was beating fast as he was ashamed of himself and did not have the courage to face his teacher. M. Himmel said to Franz that he would not scold him as now he had realized his mistake. Every day Franz told himself that he would study the next day, and now the opportunity to study had ended and he knew nothing. M. Himmel says that all the people of Alsace were to be blamed as no one was serious towards learning. He tells the class that the enemies would laugh at them and say that they only show to be Frenchmen as they can neither speak nor write their own language. He says that France should not feel guilty as everyone is at fault. M. Himmel says that Franz's parents were not interested in getting him educated. They wanted him to work at a farm or a mill and earn some money. He says that as a teacher, he was also not interested many times in teaching them. He would often send them to his home to water the plants. Sometimes he would declare a holiday and go for fishing. After that, M. Himmel praises the mother tongue, French language, as being the most beautiful, clearest, and the most logical language in the world. He tells the class to guard their language as it is the only way to free oneself from the prison of slavery. If a person knows his mother tongue well, no one can enslave him. Knowing the mother tongue well as a language is a tool to fight domination. Thereafter, the teacher took a lesson in grammar. That day, Franz was surprised that he understood the lesson with ease. He felt that had he been attentive, and that had M. Himmel also explained the lesson with a lot of patience, he felt that he could have learned so much better all this while. Franz felt that there was an air of patriotism in the class. The notebooks were like flags of France that were floating all around. The entire class was busy writing, and the only sound that could be heard was that of pen writing on the paper. In fact, the coo sound of the pigeons could be heard in the class, and Franz wondered that would the Prussians also force the pigeons also to change their language and coo in German. The writer wants to say that language comes naturally to being and it cannot be forced upon anyone, be it the pigeons or the Frenchmen. In between writing, Franz looked at M. Himmel, who sat still and stared at different things in the classroom in succession as if he wanted to memorize the appearance of everything before leaving. M. Himmel had been teaching at the same place for the last 40 years. The only changes were that the desks in the classroom had worn out due to use over the years, and the walnut trees in the garden outside had grown taller. The hop vine on the outer wall of the school building had climbed up to the roof. Franz feels that the teacher must be heartbroken to be sent away from a place where he had spent 40 years of his life. The noises of his sister packing and moving the luggage upstairs could be heard from the room as they were to leave the next day. However, M. Himmel remained composed and heard the lesson from the entire class. After the writing task, there was a lesson of history followed by phonetics, where they recited the sounds of alphabets. Now, Franz referred to the class as babies, because although they were all grown up, they were reciting the lesson, which is usually done by younger children. So he calls himself and his class to be young babies. Just then, the clock at the church struck 12 and the prayer song began. At the same moment, the sound of the trumpets played by the Prussian soldiers who were returning from the drill was heard. M. Himmel's face became dull and colorless as the time had come for the class to get over. He stood straight and motionless, and Franz says that he had never appeared to be so tall. M. Himmel began to speak but could not continue as he was overpowered by his emotions. He took a piece of chalk and wrote the words, "Viva le France," meaning "Long live France," on the blackboard as large as he could. Then he stopped writing, bent towards the wall, and without speaking anything, signaled the class to leave as the class was over. Dear students, with that we come to the end of the lesson. I do hope that you understood the contents of the lesson well. I would now request you all to read the lesson properly and attempt the questions given in the question bank in your registers. There are two types of questions given here, 2 markers and 6 markers. The word limit is also given. Please follow the same, and in case of any queries, you're most welcome to reach out to your teachers. Thank you.